The courthouse records were supposed to have been destroyed. Everyone said so. The fire of 1865 had consumed the entire building, they claimed, turning decades of Virginia's documented shame into ash and smoke. But in the basement of what used to be the Henry County Clerk's office, behind a wall that collapsed during renovations in 1973, workers found something that shouldn't exist. An iron strong box, sealed and hidden, containing papers that had been deliberately preserved. Deliberately hidden, papers that told a story so calculated, so methodical, so unspeakable that someone had chosen to lock it away rather than let it burn. The documents inside weren't official records. They were personal letters, diary entries, testimonies that were never meant to be heard, and photographs, daguerreotypes from the early 1840s showing children who shouldn't exist, 23 of them across 5 years, all with the same emerald green eyes and pale blonde hair. All born to enslaved women in Henry and Chesterfield counties, all from one father. The images were haunting. Small faces staring at the camera with expressions too old for their years. Children dressed in the rough clothing of the enslaved quarters, but with features that looked like they'd been lifted from a European portrait gallery. The eyes were what struck you first. Not blue, not gray, emerald green, bright and clear and absolutely unmistakable. And beside each photograph, written in careful script, were names, dates, plantations, and a single word that appeared again and again. Here's the woman who found these documents, brought them to a historian at the University of Virginia. The historian spent 6 months verifying what she was looking at, cross-referencing names with plantation records, birth registries, land deeds, everything checked out. Everything was real. And when she finally published her findings in a small academic journal, the response was silence. Not controversy, not outrage, just silence. Because what do you do with evidence of something so systematic, so deliberate that even 130 years later, people would rather pretend it didn't happen, but it did happen? In the tobacco counties of central Virginia between 1839 and 1844, 23 children were born with emerald eyes and blonde hair. 23 children who looked nothing like their mothers. 23 children whose very existence was evidence of something that had no name under Virginia law. Because in 1840, enslaved women were not people. They were property, and you cannot commit a crime against property. Before we go further into this story, I need you to do something. Subscribe to the Sealed Room right now. Hit that notification bell because the stories we tell here, the truths we uncover, they matter, and I want to hear from you. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, what state, what city. Now, let's uncover what really happened in those Virginia counties between 1839 and 1844. The story doesn't begin with an overseer noticing a pattern. It doesn't begin with whispers traveling between plantations. It begins with a woman named Ruth, 31 years old, standing in a cabin on a plantation called Fairview in April of 1008. 139, holding a newborn baby and understanding with absolute certainty that her life had just changed forever. Not because of what the baby looked like, though that was impossible to ignore, but because she knew. She knew what had happened. She knew who the father was, and she knew there was nothing she could do about it. Ruth had been born in Richmond, sold south to Fairview when she was 19, separated from her mother and 3 sisters in a transaction that took less time than buying a horse. She'd spent 12 years at Fairview, learning the rhythms of tobacco cultivation, learning which overseers to avoid, learning how to make herself useful enough to keep invisible enough to survive. She'd been paired with a man named Daniel when she was 23, a pairing arranged by the plantation owner to produce children who would become valuable property. Daniel was a good man, quiet, strong. He worked the tobacco fields from dawn until dusk, came back to their cabin exhausted, slept, woke, repeated. They had one daughter already, a girl named Sarah, 7 years old. Sarah looked like her parents, dark skin, dark eyes, dark hair that curled tight against her scalp. This second child should have looked the same. Ruth had carried her for 9 months, felt her move and kick and grow. She'd prepared herself for the pain of childbirth, for the exhaustion that would follow, for the strange joy of holding a new baby. Despite everything, she had not prepared for this. The baby girl in her arms had skin so pale it looked like cream, hair that came in blonde and fine, and eyes, God, those eyes, emerald green, bright as jewels, impossible. Ruth stared at her daughter and felt something crack open inside her chest. Not love, not yet, just recognition. This was evidence, this was proof. This child's face was a confession written in flesh and bone. The midwife who delivered the baby, an older woman named Patience, hadn't said a word. She'd cleaned the infant, cut the cord, wrapped her in cloth, and handed her to Ruth with an expression that said everything. I know, you know, we both know, and neither of us can speak it aloud. Daniel came to the cabin an hour later. He'd been working the far fields, hadn't heard about the birth yet. He pushed through the door with that careful exhaustion he always carried, ready to meet his second daughter. He stopped 3 ft from Ruth. His eyes went from the baby to Ruth's face to the baby again. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. No words came out. That's not mine, he finally managed. His voice was flat, empty. She's yours, Ruth whispered. She has to be. Look at her, Ruth. Look at her eyes. Look at her hair. That child isn't mine. I haven't been with anyone else. You know that. You know I haven't. Then how do you explain this? I can't. The silence that followed was worse than any words. Daniel stood there swaying slightly like a man who'd been struck in the head. Then he turned and walked out of the cabin. He didn't come back that night or the next. By the end of the week he'd requested reassignment to a different work crew, a different cabin, a different life that didn't include Ruth or the impossible baby she'd brought into the world. Ruth named her daughter Grace. The name felt like a prayer and a curse. Grace grew quickly, healthy, alert, beautiful in a way that made people stare. By 3 months old, her emerald eyes were even more striking, her blonde hair thick and soft. She looked like a porcelain doll someone had accidentally dropped into the quarters. The other enslaved people on Fairview didn't know what to make of Grace. Some avoided looking at her entirely. Others stared when they thought Ruth wasn't watching. A few of the older women approached Ruth privately, asking careful questions. Has anyone bothered you? Has anyone come to your cabin at night? Ruth's answer was always the same. No, I don't know what happened. I can't explain it, but that was a lie. Ruth knew exactly what had happened. She knew who Grace's father was. She'd known from the moment she saw those emerald eyes. She just couldn't say it out loud. Couldn't speak the name, because speaking the name meant acknowledging something so dangerous, so impossible to prove, so certain to bring punishment down on her own head, that silence was the only protection she had. The father was Jonathan Blackwell, 34 years old, the second son of the family that owned Fairview, and Ruth knew because she remembered the night it happened. Every detail, every moment burned into her memory like a brand. It had been December. The tobacco harvest was done, the curing barns full, the fields dormant until spring. The main house was preparing for Christmas, and Ruth had been called up from the quarters to help with cleaning. The regular house staff was overwhelmed with preparations for a party the Blackwells were hosting, so they'd pulled in extra hands. Ruth scrubbed floors, washed windows, polished silver, work that made her back ache and her hands crack from the cold water and lye soap. She'd finished late, past midnight, and was heading back to the quarters when Jonathan Blackwell appeared in the hallway. He'd been drinking. She could smell it on him, whiskey and tobacco and something else, something sharp and wrong. He blocked her path, smiled, asked where she was going. Ruth had kept her eyes down, murmured that she was returning to the quarters, tried to step around him. He'd moved to block her again. His hand had caught her arm. His grip was gentle at first, almost friendly, then tighter. What happened next lasted maybe 10 minutes, maybe less. Time fractured and stretched in ways Ruth couldn't track. There was a room, a door that locked. Jonathan's voice, low and calm, telling her not to fight, not to scream, that it would be easier if she didn't resist. Ruth had learned long ago that resistance brought worse punishment, so she went somewhere else in her mind, somewhere far away from her body, from the room, from what was being done to her. She floated above it all, watching from a distance, waiting for it to end. When it was over, Jonathan had straightened his clothes, told her she could go, warned her not to speak of this to anyone. Then he'd unlocked the door and walked away as though nothing had happened. Ruth had made her way back to the quarters in the dark, her body moving on instinct while her mind stayed floating, disconnected. She'd climbed into bed beside Daniel, who was already asleep, and lay there until dawn, staring at the ceiling, feeling something inside her break that would never fully heal. 3 weeks later, she'd missed her monthly bleeding. By February, she knew she was pregnant. By March, she understood with cold certainty whose child she was carrying. And in April, when Grace was born with Jonathan Blackwell's emerald green eyes staring up at her, Ruth's worst fears were confirmed. Now, holding her daughter, watching those impossible eyes track movement across the cabin, Ruth made a decision. She would raise this child. She would love her. She would protect her as much as any enslaved woman could protect her children. But she would never speak the truth aloud, never name the father, never give anyone the satisfaction of confirmation, because what good would it do? Jonathan Blackwell was white, wealthy, protected by law and social standing. Ruth was property. Her testimony meant nothing. Her pain meant nothing. Her violation meant nothing. The system was working exactly as designed. Grace was 6 months old when the second baby was born. Different plantation, different mother, same impossible features. The plantation was called Riverside, 8 miles east of Fairview along the James River. The mother was a woman named Hannah, 24 years old, who worked in the tobacco fields. The baby was a boy, blonde hair, emerald green eyes, pale skin that looked translucent in the lamplight. Hannah's reaction was different from Ruth's. She screamed when she saw her son, screamed and screamed until the midwife had to physically restrain her, hand clamped over Hannah's mouth, hissing at her to be quiet before she brought the overseer running. Hannah's partner, a man named Jacob, took one look at the baby and walked out, never came back. Hannah refused to hold her son for 3 days, refused to feed him, refused to even look at him. Finally, another woman in the quarters, someone who'd given birth herself too many times to count, forced Hannah to understand. You either feed this baby or he dies, and if he dies, they'll blame you. They'll punish you. He's your child now, whether you want him or not. Hannah named him Thomas, and she fed him, and she kept him alive, but she never stopped hating him. Never stopped seeing his emerald eyes as evidence of something she couldn't speak about, couldn't process, couldn't survive if she let herself feel it fully. The news traveled slowly at first, plantation to plantation along the James River, carried by traders who stopped at multiple landings, by enslaved people who had family connections across county lines, by the invisible network of communication that existed beneath the surface of Virginia society. 2 babies, different plantations, same impossible features. People started paying attention. The third birth happened in January of 1840, plantation called Meadowbrook, 12 miles north of Richmond. The mother was a woman named Esther, 19 years old, who'd been assigned to work in the main house kitchen. The baby was a girl, emerald eyes, blonde hair so pale it looked white in the winter sun. Esther's recorded partner, a man named Moses, disappeared the night the baby was born, just walked off the plantation. They found him 3 days later, 20 m away, half frozen, barely alive. He never spoke about why he'd run, never acknowledged the baby. When they brought him back, whipped him for running, sent him back to work. He moved like a ghost, empty, hollowed out. The fourth birth came in April of 1840, plantation called Cedar Hill, just across the county line into Chesterfield. The mother was a woman named Mary, 26 years old, strong and capable, respected in the quarters for her practical wisdom. The baby was a boy. Those same emerald eyes stared up from a face framed by blonde hair. Mary looked at her son and said nothing, just nothing. For weeks she cared for him mechanically, fed him, changed him, kept him alive, but her face stayed blank, her eyes distant, like she'd retreated somewhere inside herself where the world couldn't reach her. By summer of 1840, plantation owners across Henrio and Chesterfield counties were becoming aware of the pattern, not because they were looking for it, but because the whispers had grown too loud to ignore. 4 babies in just over a year. 4 different plantations, 4 enslaved women who all told the same story. They'd been with no one but their recorded partners. They couldn't explain their children's appearance. They had nothing more to say. The plantation owners met privately, quietly in drawing rooms and libraries over cigars and brandy, discussing the situation in the careful language of men who understood they were approaching something explosive. The consensus was clear. This was embarrassing, potentially scandalous, but not criminal, not under Virginia law. Enslaved women were property. Their children were property. Whatever had produced these stranger-looking children, it wasn't anyone's legal concern. But there was one man who couldn't let it go. His name was William Carter, 52 years old, owner of a mid-sized plantation called Ashland. Carter was unusual among Virginia planters. He'd been educated at William and Mary, had traveled extensively in Europe, had read widely in philosophy and law. He believed in slavery as an economic necessity, but was troubled by its moral implications. He tried to run his plantation humanely, which meant he didn't whip his enslaved people unless absolutely necessary, provided adequate food and shelter, didn't separate families when he could avoid it. This made him neither a hero nor a villain, just a man trying to reconcile an unconscionable system with his own sense of decency, failing at both. Carter had heard about the births through his overseer, a man named Thomas Reed. Reed was 40 years old, methodical, literate, someone who kept detailed records of everything that happened on Ashland. Reed had mentioned the pattern casually one evening in May of 1840, discussing plantation gossip as he and Carter reviewed the season's account. I heard about another one of those strange births. Reed had said, running his finger down a column of numbers, over at Cedar Hill this time, same as the others, blonde hair, green eyes. Mother swears she's been with no one but her man. How many does that make now? Carter had asked, only half paying attention, 4 that I know of, maybe more that haven't been talked about. Carter had looked up from the ledgers, 4 in how long? Just over a year, all within about 15 miles of here. That's not coincidence. No, sir, I don't believe it is. Carter set down his pen and gave Reed his full attention. Tell me everything you've heard. Reed laid out what he knew. The dates, the plantations, the mothers' names, the identical features of the children, the insistence from every mother that they'd been with no one but their recorded partners. The pattern was undeniable once you saw it laid out plainly. Someone is fathering these children, Carter said slowly. Someone who has access to multiple plantations. Someone who moves between properties without drawing attention. Yes, sir, that's what I've been thinking. Who? Reed hesitated, then pulled a small notebook from his pocket. He'd been keeping his own records, apparently making notes, tracking patterns within the pattern. I've been paying attention to who visits these plantations. Sir, traders, overseers from neighboring properties, doctors, clergy, anyone who might have opportunity, and there's one name that appears more often than chance would suggest. Carter waited. Jonathan Blackwell, sir, from Fairview. The Blackwell family was well known in Henry County. Old money, old Virginia. They'd held their land since colonial times, survived the Revolution, prospered under the new nation. The current patriarch, Edmund Blackwell, was 68 years old, respected, influential. His oldest son, Charles, was being groomed to take over the plantation. His second son, Jonathan, was something of a disappointment. 34 years old, unmarried, known for drinking too much and accomplishing too little. He lived at Fairview, but had no real responsibilities, spending his time riding between neighboring plantations, visiting friends, attending social gatherings. What's the connection? Carter asked. Reed flipped through his notebook. Jonathan Blackwell attended a dinner party at Riverside 3 months before Hannah's baby was born. He was at Meadowbrook visiting the family 2 months before Esther's baby was born. He stopped at Cedar Hill during a hunting trip 3 months before Mary's baby was born, and the first one at Fairview, that's his own plantation. Sir, he lives there. Carter sat back in his chair, his mind working through the implications. This was serious. If Jonathan Blackwell was responsible, if he was deliberately fathering children with enslaved women across multiple plantations, the scandal would be enormous. Not because such things didn't happen. They happened constantly, but because of the pattern, the deliberateness, the emerald eyes that marked each child as unmistakably his. What are you suggesting we do? Reed asked carefully. Carter didn't answer immediately. He understood the delicate position he was in. Jonathan Blackwell came from one of the most powerful families in the county. Accusing him without absolute proof would be social suicide, but doing nothing felt like complicity. I need to think about this, Carter finally said. Say nothing to anyone. Keep tracking the pattern if there are more births. But quietly, very quietly, yes, sir, over the following months, Carter wrestled with what to do. He consulted his law books, looking for any statute that might apply. But Virginia law in 1008, 140 was clear. Enslaved people were property. They had no legal standing. They couldn't bring charges. They couldn't testify against white people in court. And the children born to enslaved women belonged to the women's owners regardless of paternity. There was no crime here, not legally, but morally. Carter couldn't shake the feeling that something profoundly wrong was happening, that the pattern suggested not just casual exploitation, but something calculated, something systematic. The 5th birth came in August of 1008, 140, plantation called Willow Creek, 10 miles west of Richmond. The mother was a woman named Abigail, 22 years old. The baby was a girl, emerald eyes, blonde hair. Abigail held her daughter and wept silently, tears streaming down her face without sound, her body shaking. Her partner, a man named Samuel, stared at the baby for a long time, then simply said, I can't do this. He left the cabin and never came back to it as a home. They worked the same fields, passed each other daily, but Samuel never spoke to Abigail again, never acknowledged the child. Reed reported the birth to Carter. Jonathan Blackwell had been at Willow Creek 4 months earlier attending a barbecue. The sixth birth came in November of 1008, 140, plantation called Greenwood. Mother named Rebecca, 28 years old, baby boy. Same features, same impossible emerald eyes. Rebecca's partner, a man named Benjamin, became violent when he saw the child, smashed the cabin's only chair, punched a hole through the wooden wall, screamed questions that had no answers. Who was it? Who did you let touch you? Rebecca couldn't answer because she didn't know how to explain what had happened without speaking words that would get her killed. The pattern was accelerating. 6 babies in less than 2 years, and Jonathan Blackwell's name appeared in the background of every single situation. Always visiting, always present at the right plantation at the right time, never obviously, never suspiciously, just there. Orchestrated narrative progression with deepened emotional stakes. I need to continue building the pattern, introduce more perspectives and start moving toward the investigation and revelation. I should maintain the emotional intensity while adding new layers to the story. Let me continue with the development. Carter decided he needed to speak with the mothers directly, not to interrogate them, not to demand answers, but to offer them something no one else had, the opportunity to be heard. He started with Ruth at Fairview, since she was the first mother and her daughter Grace was now 18 months old. Walking, talking, those emerald eyes bright and aware. Carter arranged to visit Fairview on the pretext of discussing a business matter with Edmund Blackwell. While there, he asked permission to inspect the quarters, claiming he was considering changes to the cabin lay, out at his own plantation, and wanted to see how Fairview managed it. Edmund, proud of his property, agreed readily. Carter found Ruth working outside her cabin, hanging laundry on a line strung between 2 posts. Grace was playing in the dirt nearby, her blonde hair catching the afternoon sun like a beacon. The child was stunning, unnaturally beautiful, and completely out of place. Ruth saw Carter approaching and immediately went still, her hands frozen on the wet sheet she was hanging. Every enslaved person knew that when a white man approached with purpose, it rarely meant anything good. Ruth, Carter said gently, I'd like to speak with you if you're willing. Yes, sir. Ruth's voice was carefully neutral. About your daughter. Ruth's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Grace is healthy, sir. No trouble. I'm not here about trouble. I'm here because I want to understand what happened, who her father is. The silence stretched between them. Grace babbled something in her toddler language, oblivious to the tension. Daniel is her father, sir. Ruth finally said, that's what the records show. Ruth, I know that's not true, and I think you know who the real father is. Ruth turned to face him directly for the first time. Her eyes were hard, guarded, filled with something Carter couldn't quite name. Grief maybe, or rage buried so deep it had turned to stone. With respect, sir, what difference does it make who I think the father is? I'm property, my daughter is property. Property doesn't get to name fathers. Property doesn't get justice. Property just survives. I want to help. Ruth laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. Help how, sir? You going to give me my freedom? You going to make my daughter free? You going to arrest a white man based on the testimony of a slave woman? Because unless you can do one of those things, your help is just words. Carter felt the truth of her words like a physical blow. She was right, completely right. He had no real power to help her, no legal avenue to pursue, no way to deliver justice even if she told him everything. But I can document what happened, Carter said quietly. I can create a record so that someday when things change, when the law changes, there's evidence, there's truth preserved. Truth doesn't matter without power, sir. Maybe not now, but someday it might. Ruth stared at him for a long moment, evaluating, deciding whether this white man was sincere or just another kind of danger. Finally she spoke, her voice low and controlled. "His name is Jonathan Blackwell. He came to me in December of 1838. I was working in the main house. He cornered me, locked a door, told me not to fight. I didn't fight because I wanted to live. I didn't scream because I wanted to wake up the next morning. I didn't tell anyone because who would believe me, who would care? 9 months later, Grace was born, and every time I look at her eyes, I see his eyes. Every time I hear her laugh, I remember that night. Every time I hold her, I feel him still touching me. That's the truth, sir. You want to write it down, but it won't change anything. It won't punish him. It won't protect the next woman. It won't make my daughter any less a slave. It won't make me any less property." Carter felt something break inside his chest. The casual way she spoke about her own violation, the matter-of-fact acceptance that nothing would change, the understanding that her truth had no value in the world they lived in. "I'm sorry," he managed. "I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't help either, sir." Ruth turned back to her laundry. "If you're done asking questions, I need to finish my work before dark." Carter left Fèvre, shaken. He'd known intellectually that the system was cruel, that enslaved people suffered in ways he could barely comprehend. But hearing Ruth speak so plainly about her violation, about the absolute powerlessness of her position, made it real in a way that abstract knowledge never could. He visited the other mothers over the following weeks, travelled to Riverside, to Meadowbrook, to Cedar Hill, to Willow Creek, to Greenwood. Each time he used some pretext to gain access to the quarters, to speak with the women privately, and each time the story was the same. Jonathan Blackwell access to the main house or to isolated locations. A locked room or a threat, or simply the understanding that resistance was pointless violation. Silence. 9 months later, a baby with emerald eyes. Hannah at Riverside told him through tears. He said if I screamed, he'd have me whipped. So I didn't scream. Esther at Meadowbrook told him while staring at the ground. He smelled like whiskey and tobacco. I remember that smell. I still smell it sometimes, and I can't breathe. Mary at Cedar Hill told him in a flat, dead voice. I stopped fighting after the first minute. What's the point? He was going to do what he wanted. I just wanted it to be over. Abigail at Willow Creek couldn't speak at all. She just nodded when Carter said Jonathan's name, nodded and closed her eyes and stood there trembling. Rebecca at Greenwood told him with anger burning in every word. "You want to know who the father is. Look at my son's eyes. They're his eyes. That's all the proof you need. That's all the proof that matters. And it means nothing because we're property and property can't be raped." Carter documented everything. Dates, names, testimonies. He cross-referenced Jonathan Blackwell's movements, confirming his presence at each plantation during the crucial time periods. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, completely useless under Virginia law. By spring of 1841 there were 8 children. The pattern was so clear, so unmistakable, that even plantation owners who'd initially dismissed it as coincidence had to acknowledge something was happening. But acknowledging it and doing something about it were different matters. Carter tried to approach Edmund Blackwell directly. He requested a meeting, was granted one, sat in Edmund's study, surrounded by portraits of Blackwell ancestors, and tried to explain what his son had done. Edmund listened in stony silence. When Carter finished, Edmund stood and walked to the window, his back to Carter. "My son is not a rapist." Edmund said quietly, "Edmund, the evidence, there is no evidence. There are accusations from women who have no legal standing to make accusations. There are children who happen to have light features. That proves nothing. 8 children. Edmund 8, all with the same distinctive features, all born to mothers who had contact with Jonathan at the precise time needed for conception. Coincidence? Or perhaps these women were with white men from other plantations, and are lying about who the fathers are. Why would they lie to cause trouble, to create scandal? Who knows why slaves do what they do? Carter felt frustration rising in his throat. These women aren't lying, they're terrified, they're traumatized. They're trying to survive in a system that gives them no protection. This conversation is over, Edmund said, turning back to face Carter. His face was hard, closed. My son is innocent. These accusations are slander. If you repeat them publicly, I will destroy you. I will ruin your reputation, your business, your standing in this county. Do you understand, Edmund? Do you understand? Yes. Carter stood defeated. I understand. He left Fairview knowing the battle was lost before it had begun. The Blackwell family had too much power, too much influence, and the law itself was on their side. Because in Virginia in 1841, enslaved women were not people. They were property, and you cannot commit a crime against property. The births continued through 1841 and 1842, 2 more in the summer, 3 in the fall, another in winter, 4 in spring. The children grew. Grace at Fairview was now 3 years old, speaking in full sentences, asking questions about why she looked different from the other children in the quarters. Thomas at Riverside was too bright and curious, reaching for his mother, who still flinched every time she saw his emerald eyes. The babies born more recently were still infants, but already their distinctive features were setting them apart, marking them as different as evidence of something no one wanted to acknowledge. The women started meeting in secret. Not all of them, but some, the ones who could find ways to slip away from their plantations unnoticed, who had family connections or work assignments that brought them to the same locations. They met at a church on the outskirts of Richmond, a small building where free black people and enslaved people who had permission to attend services gathered on Sunday afternoons. The church was called Mount Zion, and its minister was a man named Reverend Isaiah Grant, 47 years old, born free in Philadelphia, who'd come to Virginia to preach despite the dangers of being a free black man in a slave state. Reverend Grant had noticed the women, the way they sat together, the way they looked at each other with recognition that went deeper than normal fellowship, the way they held their stranger-looking children close, protective, ashamed, defiant, all at once. He'd heard the rumors, of course. Everyone had the babies with emerald eyes, the pattern that suggested something deliberate, something monstrous. One Sunday in June of 1842, after the service ended and most people had left, Reverend Grant approached Ruth. She was sitting on a bench outside the church, Grace playing nearby with the other children. The little girl was 4 now, her blonde hair long and carefully braided, her emerald eyes bright as she chased another child around a tree. "Sister Ruth," Reverend Grant said gently, "may I speak with you?" Ruth looked up weary. "Yes, Reverend, I've been watching you and some of the other women, the ones with children like yours, children who look like they've been touched by something impossible." Ruth's face went carefully blank. "I don't know what you mean, Reverend." "I think you do. And I think you're carrying something too heavy to carry alone." The words broke something in Ruth. She started crying, not the silent tears she'd learned to hide, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere she'd kept locked away for years. Reverend Grant sat beside her, said nothing, just waited. Sometimes the greatest kindness was simply bearing witness. When Ruth could speak again, she told him everything. Jonathan Blackwell, the locked room, the violation, Grace's impossible eyes, the other women she'd met who had the same story, the same nightmare, the same children marked by the same man. She told him about William Carter's investigation, about Edmund Blackwell's threats, about the absolute impossibility of justice under Virginia law. Reverend Grant listened to it all. When Ruth finished, he was quiet for a long time, his face grave. "How many women?" he finally asked. "That I know of, 9. But I think there might be more who haven't spoken, who are too afraid, and the children, 14. The oldest is Grace. The youngest was born last month." Reverend Grant stood and paced a few steps, thinking. Ruth watched him, hoping for something. Wisdom, comfort, some way forward. "That didn't exist. The law won't protect you." Reverend Grant said, "We both know that Virginia law sees you as property. Your testimony means nothing. Your pain means nothing. Your children are property that belongs to your owners. There's no legal recourse. I know, but there are other kinds of power besides the law." Ruth looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean that Virginia's planters care deeply about reputation, about social standing, about how they are seen by their peers. A legal case might be impossible, but public scandal, public shame, that's something they fear. You want us to speak publicly." Ruth's voice was incredulous. "They'd kill us or sell us away from our children." "Or worse, not you. You can't speak. Your voices don't carry in this world, but mine does. I'm free. I have standing. I can write. I can publish. I can tell your story in ways that reach people who matter. And you think that would change anything. I don't know. But I know that silence protects the powerful. And I know that sometimes the only weapon the powerless have is truth, spoken loudly enough that people can't ignore it." Ruth considered this. The idea was terrifying, dangerous. It could bring punishment down on her, on the other women, on their children. But it could also do something they'd never been able to do themselves. Make noise, force people to see. Refused to let this be buried in silence. "Let me talk to the others," Ruth said. "See if they're willing." Over the following weeks, Ruth spoke with the other mothers she knew. Hannah at Riverside, Esther at Meadowbrook, Mary at Cedar Hill, Abigail at Willow Creek, Rebecca at Greenwood, and 3 others, women named Sarah, Catherine, and Elizabeth, from plantations Ruth had only recently learned about. 12 women total, 12 mothers of children with emerald eyes. The conversations were difficult. Some women were too afraid. The risk of speaking, even through Reverend Grant's voice, felt too great, but others were angry. So angry they'd burn everything down if it meant Jonathan Blackwell faced consequences. In the end, 7 agreed to share their stories. 7 testimonies that Reverend Grant could weave into a document that would expose what had happened. Reverend Grant worked through the summer of 1042, interviewing each woman privately, recording their testimonies with careful precision. He documented dates, locations, circumstances. He noted the distinctive emerald eyes that marked each child. He created a timeline that showed the pattern with undeniable clarity, and he wrote an essay, powerful and uncompromising, that laid out the evidence and demanded accountability. He titled it "A System That Protects Monsters: The Case of Jonathan Blackwell and the Violation of Enslaved Women in Henry County, Virginia." The essay was 15 pages long. It began with a philosophical argument about the nature of law and justice, questioning whether a legal system that defined human beings as property could ever deliver moral justice. Then it detailed the testimonies of the 7 women, presenting their stories in their own words as much as possible. Finally, it concluded with a direct challenge to Virginia's planters. If you claim to be Christian men, if you claim to value honor and decency, if you claim that slavery is a benevolent institution, then explain Jonathan Blackwell. Explain 14 children with emerald eyes. Explain a pattern so deliberate it can only be called systematic. Explain your silence. Reverend Grant knew the essay was dangerous. Publishing it could get him arrested, beaten, killed. Free black men who challenged the system didn't survive long in Virginia. But he also knew that silence was complicity, and he'd rather die speaking truth than live as an accomplice to horror. He sent the essay to 3 publications: an abolitionist newspaper in Philadelphia, a religious journal in Boston, and a small Richmond paper known for occasionally publishing controversial pieces. The Philadelphia paper printed it in September of 1842. The Boston Journal printed it in October. The Richmond paper refused, but copies of the other publications made their way back to Virginia, passed from hand to hand, read in secret, discussed in whispers. The reaction was explosive. Abolitionists in the North seized on the story as evidence of slavery's inherent evil, the systematic violation of enslaved women, the creation of children as evidence, the absolute legal immunity of the perpetrator. It confirmed everything they'd been arguing about the moral bankruptcy of the institution. In Virginia, the response was fury, not at Jonathan Blackwell, at Reverend Grant. How dare a free black man make such accusations? How dare he slander a prominent Virginia family? How dare he spread lies designed to damage the South's reputation? The essay was denounced from pulpits in newspapers in the Virginia General Assembly. Reverend Grant was called a liar, an agitator, a tool of Northern abolitionists seeking to destroy Southern society. Edmund Blackwell demanded Reverend Grant's arrest. He hired lawyers, filed complaints, used every legal tool available. But Reverend Grant hadn't broken any Virginia law. He'd published in Northern papers beyond Virginia's jurisdiction. He'd stated facts, presented testimonies, asked questions. Nothing he'd written was technically criminal, however inflammatory. But legal immunity didn't mean safety. In November of 1842, Reverend Grant's church was burned to the ground. Mount Zion went up in flames one night, the fire visible for miles, the building reduced to ash by morning. No one was caught, no one was charged, everyone understood it was a warning. Reverend Grant fled Virginia a week later, barely ahead of a mob that would have killed him. He made it to Philadelphia, continued his ministry there, kept writing about the Blackwell case and others like it. But his departure left the women in Virginia without their voice, without their advocate, alone again with their Emeraldi children and their unspeakable knowledge. Jonathan Blackwell's response to the essay was silence. He didn't deny the accusations, didn't defend himself, didn't speak publicly at all. He simply continued his life as before, riding between plantations, attending social gatherings, drinking too much, accomplishing too little. The only change was subtle. He stopped visiting plantations outside Fairview, stopped attending dinner parties and barbecues at neighboring properties. He stayed home within his family's protection, surrounded by people who would never question him. Because that's what the system did. It protected men like Jonathan Blackwell. It gave them absolute power over people defined as property. It made their crimes invisible, their violations legal, their victims silent. And when someone tried to speak truth, when someone tried to pierce that silence, the system crushed them, burned their churches, drove them into exile, preserved the power structure at any cost. The births continued through 1843. 3 more children, all with emerald eyes, all born to women at Fairview, Jonathan's own plantation, where he no longer needed to travel elsewhere. The pattern had shifted, but not stopped. He just narrowed his hunting ground. William Carter watched all of this with growing despair. He documented everything in his private papers, the testimonies, the pattern, Reverend Grant's essay, the violent response, the continued births. He had a comprehensive record of a systematic crime that was not legally a crime, evidence that meant nothing, truth that had no power. In spring of 1844, Carter made one final attempt. He requested a meeting with Virginia's governor, James McDowell, a man known for his relatively moderate views on slavery. Carter traveled to Richmond, presented his evidence, laid out the case with clinical precision. 18 children now, 18. all with distinctive emerald green eyes and blonde hair, all born to enslaved women in Henrio and Chesterfield counties, all fathered by one man, Jonathan Blackwell. Governor McDowell listened politely, reviewed the documents Carter had brought, asked careful questions, then gave Carter an answer that was both honest and devastating. Mr. Carter, everything you've shown me is likely true. The pattern is undeniable. The evidence is compelling. Jonathan Blackwell is almost certainly guilty of exactly what you're accusing him of. But under Virginia law, he has committed no crime. Enslaved women are property. Their owners might have civil complaints about damage to their property, but the women themselves have no standing to bring criminal charges. And even if they did, their testimony would not be admissible against a white man in court. There is no legal mechanism to prosecute Jonathan Blackwell, none. The law is working exactly as the legislature designed it. So we do nothing? Carter asked, hearing the bitterness in his own voice. What would you have me do? The governor's tone was not unkind, just tired, just realistic. Change the law, make enslaved people persons under the law, give them rights, legal standing, the ability to testify against white people. Do you understand what that would mean? It would unravel the entire system. Every plantation owner in Virginia would rise up against it. The legislature would never pass it. And if by some miracle they did, it would tear this state apart. So the system is more important than justice. The system is justice, Mr. Carter. At least that's what our laws say. Our laws define justice as the protection of property rights. Enslaved people are property. Their owners' rights must be protected. That's the foundation Virginia is built on. You can argue it's wrong. You can call it immoral. You can rage against it, but you can't change it through the legal system, because the legal system is designed to preserve it. Carter left Richmond understanding that he'd reached the end. There was nothing more he could do. The law wouldn't help. Public pressure wouldn't work. The system was too strong, too entrenched, too invested in protecting men like Jonathan Blackwell. He went home to Ashland, filed his papers away in a strong box, and tried to return to normal life. But normal felt impossible now. Every day he ran his plantation. He was participating in the same system that had made the Blackwell case possible. Every day he benefited from the same laws that denied justice to those 18 mothers. The final birth in the pattern came in August of 1008, 144. Fairview Plantation. Mother named Margaret, 21 years old. Baby girl, emerald eyes, blonde hair so pale it looked like spun silver. Margaret looked at her daughter and said 7 words that would stay with everyone who heard them. This is the last one he'll make. 3 days later, Jonathan Blackwell was found dead in his bedroom at Fairview. The official cause was heart failure. He was 39 years old, relatively healthy, no history of heart problems. The doctor who examined the body, a man named Frederick Morris, who'd been serving the Blackwell family for years, wrote natural causes on the death certificate without hesitation. The funeral was small, private, unremarkable, but the enslaved people at Fairview knew better. They whispered about Margaret, about the strange plant that grew near the creek, about the tea she'd been seen making 3 days before Jonathan died. They whispered about justice that came not from courts or laws, but from the desperate courage of a woman who decided some crimes demanded payment regardless of cost. They whispered, and they never told, never confirmed, never spoke where white people could hear. Margaret was sold away from Fairview 2 weeks after Jonathan's death. Edmund Blackwell claimed he needed to reduce his workforce, needed to raise capital. Margaret was sent to a plantation in Georgia. Separated from her infant daughter, who remained at Fairview's property, the baby was raised by another woman in the quarters, grew up never knowing her mother, carrying emerald eyes and blonde hair as the only evidence of where she'd come from. The other children grew up scattered across Virginia. Some remained on the plantations where they were born. Others were sold as they got older, their distinctive appearance making them valuable for certain purposes. The girls especially were sought after by traders who dealt in what the system called fancy trade, enslaved women with light, kin, European features who could be sold for sexual exploitation to wealthy men who wanted the appearance of whiteness without the social complications of relationships with white women. Grace, Ruth's daughter, was sold when she was 12, sent to New Orleans, where her emerald eyes and blonde hair made her valuable. Ruth never saw her again, never knew what became of her, spent the rest of her life wondering if Grace was alive, if she was suffering, if she remembered her mother at all. Thomas, Hannah's son, was kept at Riverside until he was 15, then sold to a plantation in South Carolina. Hannah died 2 years later. Some said it was fever, others said it was a broken heart, though that wasn't something doctors wrote on death certificates. The pattern of birth stopped after Jonathan Blackwell's death. No more emerald. Died children appeared in Henrio or Chesterfield counties. The whispers faded, the scandal became history, the children remained, but as they were sold away, scattered across the South, the visible evidence of what had happened disappeared. Within 10 years, most people had forgotten or pretended to forget, which amounted to the same thing. William Carter kept his records. When the Civil War came, when Virginia seceded, when the fighting tore through the countryside, Carter hid his strong box in the basement of his house. He survived the war, barely, watched his plantation burn, watched the world he'd known collapse. When slavery ended, when the 13th Amendment made it unconstitutional to own human beings as property, Carter felt something he hadn't expected. Not triumph, not vindication, just profound exhaustion. He died in 1008, 172 at the age of 84. His papers were inherited by his daughter, who'd married a Richmond lawyer. She found the strong box, read the documents inside, and was horrified by what her father had documented. The systematic violation of enslaved women, the 18 children with emerald eyes, Jonathan Blackwell's impunity, Margaret's possible revenge, the absolute failure of law and justice. She didn't know what to do with this information, so she did what many people did with uncomfortable truths. She hid it, put the strong box back in the basement, told no one, let it sit in darkness. The strong box stayed there for 101 years, surviving fires and floods and the slow decay of time until workers renovating the old house found it in 1973, pulled it out from behind a collapsed wall, opened it, and discovered a story Virginia had tried to forget. The historian who examined the documents in 1973 was a woman named Dr. Elena Hayes, 42 years old, professor of American history at the University of Virginia. She spent her career studying the antebellum South, focusing on the lives of enslaved people whose stories had been deliberately erased from official records. When the construction workers brought her the strong box, not knowing what else to do with century-old papers that seemed important, Dr. Hayes understood immediately what she was looking at. William Carter's handwriting was precise, methodical, the work of someone who understood he was creating evidence that might matter someday. The testimonies were dated and signed with X marks, the women unable to write their own names, but leaving their mark as witness. The timeline was meticulous, showing Jonathan Blackwell's presence at each plantation exactly 3 months before each birth. And the photographs, the photographs, 23D, gerotypes, carefully preserved, showing children who shouldn't exist. Dr. Hayes spent 6 months verifying everything. She cross-referenced names with plantation records held in county archives. She tracked birth registries, death certificates, sale documents. She traced property deeds to confirm which families owned which plantations in the 1840s. She contacted descendants of the families involved, asking careful questions, looking for any surviving documentation. Everything checked out, every detail was accurate. William Carter had documented a systematic crime with scientific precision. Dr. Hayes published her findings in the Journal of Southern History in December of 1974. The article was titled The Blackwell Case, Systematic Sexual Violation and Legal Impunity in Antebellum, Virginia. It was 37 pages long, heavily footnoted, filled with primary source documentation. It named names Jonathan Blackwell, Edmund Blackwell, the plantation owners who'd known and done nothing. Governor who'd admitted the law couldn't help. The system that had protected a monster while denying justice to his victims. The academic response was mixed. Some historians praised Dr. Hayes for bringing this story to light, for using rigorous methodology to document something that slavery defenders had always denied. The systematic sexual exploitation of enslaved women, the calculated nature of the abuse, the complete legal immunity of the perpetrators. But others criticized her harshly. They said she was sensationalizing, that she was using one extreme case to condemn the entire institution, that she was letting modern moral standards cloud her judgment of historical context, that she should have been more balanced, more objective, less emotional in her presentation. Dr. Hayes ignored the critics. She knew what she'd found, she knew what it meant, and she knew that women whose testimonies filled William Carter's documents deserved to have their truth told, even if it made people uncomfortable, even if it challenged accepted narratives about the Old South. But publishing the academic article was only the first step. Dr. Hayes wanted to know what had happened to the children, the 23 babies born with emerald eyes between 1839 and 1844. Where had they gone? Had any of them survived to adulthood? Did they have descendants? Could those descendants be found? The search took years. Dr. Hayes worked with genealogists, with local historians, with amateur researchers who became fascinated by the case. They traced sale records following the children as they were scattered across the South. They found death certificates for some who died young. They found marriage records for others who'd survived to adulthood. They found trails that led to descendants living in the 1970s. People who had no idea their great-great-grandparents had been part of this story. Grace, Ruth's daughter, the first child born in the pattern, had been sold to New Orleans at age 12. Records showed she'd been purchased by a wealthy merchant named Louis Chiolier for what the documents called domestic service, a euphemism everyone understood. Grace had lived in Chevalier's household for 6 years. Then in 1857 she'd been freed. Manumission papers showed that Chevier had granted her freedom and left her a small sum of money in his will. Whether this was conscience or calculation, no one could say. Grace had married a free black man named Marcus Freeman in 1858. They'd had 4 children together, raised them in New Orleans through the Civil War and Reconstruction. Grace had died in 1892 at age 53. Her death certificate listed the cause as pneumonia. But her granddaughter, interviewed by Dr. Hayes in 1976, remembered different stories. Stories Grace had told late at night when the younger children were asleep. Stories about Virginia, about a mother named Ruth, about a white man with emerald eyes who'd hurt people and gotten away with it until someone stopped him. "You mean Margaret." Dr. Hayes had asked the woman who some people say poisoned Jonathan Blackwell. Grandma Grace never said it directly, but she smiled when she told that part of the story, said, "Justice doesn't always come from courts. Sometimes it comes from courage. Sometimes it comes from women who decide enough is enough." The granddaughter was 74 years old, living in a small house in the Tremor neighborhood of New Orleans. Her name was Sarah Freeman Baptiste, and when Dr. Hayes asked if she'd ever seen photographs of her grandmother, Sarah disappeared into her bedroom and came back with a small wooden box. Inside were 3 photographs: Grace at age 20, Grace at age 35, Grace at age 48. In each one those emerald eyes stared out from the frame, bright and clear and unmistakable, beautiful and haunted and defiant all at once. She never talked much. About her childhood, Sarah said softly, holding the photographs carefully, said it was too painful, but she made sure we knew where we came from, made sure we understood that we survived, that survival itself was resistance. Dr. Hayes found 11 other descendants of the Emeraldi children scattered across the country, some in Louisiana, some in Georgia, some who'd migrated north during the Great Migration to Chicago and Detroit and New York. Most didn't know the full story of their ancestors. They knew family legends, fragments, pieces, but Dr. Hayes brought them the documentation, the testimonies, the photographs, the proof that their ancestors' suffering had been real, had been documented, had been preserved by a white man who tried to help even when the law made help impossible. The descendants had mixed reactions. Some were grateful, feeling that finally their ancestors were being recognized, their pain acknowledged. Others were angry, feeling that the story was being told by outsiders, that their family trauma was being made public without their consent. A few wanted nothing to do with it, wanted to leave the past buried, wanted to move forward without carrying that. Wait, Dr. Hayes understood all of it. Trauma doesn't disappear with time. It gets passed down, transformed, carried in different ways by different generations. The children born with emerald eyes had grown up marked by their origins, struggling with identities that didn't fit neatly into any category. Their children had inherited that complexity, and their children's children, all the way down to people living in the 1970s. Who still felt the echoes of what Jonathan Blackwell had done more than 130 years earlier. In 1978, Dr. Hayes organized a gathering. She invited all the descendants she'd been able to locate, along with historians, journalists, and community members interested in the story. The event was held at a church in Richmond, not far from where Mount Zion had stood before it burned. 23 people attended. Some were descendants of the Emeraldi children. Others were descendants of the mothers, families that had survived and remembered. They came together in a room for the first time, connected by a history most of the world had forgotten. The gathering was emotional. People cried. They shared stories they'd heard from grandparents and great-grandparents. They looked at the photographs of the children, seeing family resemblances across generations. They held the documents William Carter had preserved, reading the testimonies their ancestors had given, hearing voices that had been silenced for more than a century. One woman, a descendant of Hannah from Riverside, stood and spoke to the room. Her name was Dorothy Mitchell, 56 years old, a school teacher from Atlanta. My great-great-grandmother Hannah never recovered from what happened to her, Dorothy said, her voice shaking slightly. She raised my great-grandfather, Thomas, but everyone said she was never really there, never really present. Something in her broke that couldn't be fixed. She died young, heartbroken, people said, but it wasn't a broken heart, it was a shattered soul. And knowing that now, knowing the truth of what was done to her, it doesn't make it better, but it makes it real. It gives her pain a name, it honors what she survived. Others spoke. Descendants of Ruth, of Mary, of Esther, of the women whose names were recorded in William Carter's careful handwriting. They spoke about inherited trauma, about family silences, about the weight of knowing your existence came from violation. They spoke about resilience, about survival, about the strength it took to raise children in those circumstances, to love them despite everything, to pass on life, even when life had been so cruel. And they spoke about justice, the kind that never came through courts or laws, the kind that Margaret might have delivered with poison in tea, the kind that came from simply surviving, from refusing to be erased, from existing as evidence that the system's crimes could not be completely buried. Dr. Hayes continued researching the case for the rest of her career. She published 2 more articles, then a book in 1983 titled Emerald Eyes, Sexual Violence and Legal Immunity in the Antebellum South. The book used the Blackwell case as a lens to examine the broader patterns of systematic sexual exploitation under slavery, the way the law was deliberately structured to deny enslaved women any protection, the way plantation owners and their sons could violate women with absolute impunity, the way the children born from those violations were evidence that couldn't be spoken, proof that couldn't be acknowledged, truth that had to be hidden to preserve the fiction that slavery was a benevolent institution. The book won awards. It became required reading in many university courses on American history. It brought the Blackwell case into the broader conversation about slavery's horrors, about the specific ways enslaved women suffered, about the intersection of racial and sexual violence that defined the institution. But more importantly, it gave the women and their descendants something they'd never had: recognition, acknowledgement, a place in history that wasn't hidden or erased or explained away. Ruth, Hannah, Esther, Mary, Abigail, Rebecca, Sarah, Catherine, Elizabeth, Margaret, and the others whose names appeared in the records, they were no longer just property, no longer just victims. They were human beings whose suffering mattered, whose voices deserved to be heard, whose truth had survived despite every attempt to bury it. The Blackwell family tried to suppress the book. Descendants of Edmund Blackwell, still living in Virginia, still influential, hired lawyers to challenge Dr. Hayes's research. They claimed the documents were fraudulent, that William Carter had fabricated the testimonies, that Jonathan Blackwell had been slandered. They threatened lawsuits, they pressured the publisher, they tried everything they could to prevent the story from spreading. They failed. The documentation was too solid, the evidence too compelling, the photographs too real. You could deny testimony, you could question documents, but you couldn't explain away 23 children with emerald eyes who'd been photographed, documented, tracked through sale records and birth registries. They existed. Their descendants existed. The truth existed. In 1991, the state of Virginia erected a historical marker near the site where Fairview Plantation once stood. The marker read, "On this site stood Fairview, a tobacco plantation where systematic sexual violence against enslaved women occurred between 1839 and 1844. 23 children were born from these crimes, marked by distinctive features that served as evidence the legal system refused to acknowledge. This marker stands in memory of the victims and in recognition that justice delayed for more than a century is still justice owed. The marker was vandalized twice, torn down once, but it was replaced each time. Eventually, people stopped destroying it. Eventually, it became part of the landscape, a reminder that couldn't be erased. Dr. Elena Hayes died in 2006 at age 75. She'd spent 33 years researching and writing about the Blackwell case, about the women who'd suffered, about the children who'd survived, about the descendants who carried that history forward. Her papers and research materials were donated to the Library of Virginia, where they remain accessible to anyone who wants to understand this chapter of American history. The Emeraldi children's descendants continue to gather occasionally, not every year, but sometimes. They stay connected through the shared knowledge of where they came from, what their ancestors survived, how their very existence is evidence of both horror and resilience. Some have done DNA testing, confirming what the photographs and documents already showed. They carry Jonathan Blackwell's genes. The man who violated their great-grandmothers is in their blood, in their features, in the emerald eyes that still appear in some family lines generation after generation. It's a complicated inheritance. DNA from a rapist features that mark them as connected to violence, but they've chosen to see it differently, not as shame, but as survival. Their ancestors endured the unendurable, raised children under impossible circumstances, passed on life despite everything. That's the legacy they claim, not the crime, but the courage that followed it. The story of Virginia's Emeraldi children reveals something essential about American slavery that's often obscured in more sanitized historical narratives. The institution wasn't just about labor exploitation or economic calculation. It was about absolute power wielded over people who had been legally stripped of their humanity. It was about the systematic denial of personhood, the reduction of human beings to property, the creation of a legal framework that made the most monstrous crimes invisible. Jonathan Blackwell was not an aberration. He was the system working exactly as designed, a white man with access, opportunity, and complete legal immunity. The law protected him because the law was written to protect men like him. The women he violated had no recourse because they were property. Their children became property. Their pain became invisible. Their truth became unspeakable. What makes the Blackwell case unusual is not that it happened. It's that it was documented, that William Carter preserved evidence, that Reverend Grant published testimonies, that Dr. Hayes found the records and brought them to light. Most cases like this disappeared without trace. The women suffered in silence. The children grew up marked but unnamed. The perpetrators died peacefully, their crimes buried with them, but this case survived. The truth survived. 23 children with emerald eyes who became hundreds of descendants who exist today carrying that history in their genes and their memories. They are living evidence that some truths refuse to stay buried. Documentation matters. That preservation of even the most painful stories serves justice in ways that take generations to understand. The system that made the Blackwell case possible no longer exists. Slavery ended. The 13th Amendment declared that owning human beings as property was unconstitutional. Laws changed to recognize that all people, regardless of race, have legal standing and rights. The absolute immunity that protected men like Jonathan Blackwell was abolished, but the legacy remains in the descendants who still gather to remember, in the historical markers that name the truth, in the academic research that refuses to let these stories disappear, in the knowledge that justice, however delayed, however incomplete, still matters, that naming crimes matters, that honoring victims matters, that preserving truth matters even when the truth is terrible. Ruth died in 1868 at age 59. She lived long enough to see slavery end, to be legally free, to know that the system that had made her violation invisible no longer had the force of law. But she never saw Grace again, never knew if her daughter survived, if she was free, if she remembered Virginia and the mother who tried to protect her. Ruth was